Hi there, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So for today's video, this was actually a request from one of the viewers which wanted to know a bit more about kind of what my experiences have been with pon, looking at things like pots that I use, all of these things basically. So I thought I'd structure this video in a way that will address several things that I've learned along the way and also give some of my tips essentially. So what I'm hoping to cover in this video is the option of DIY pon, especially if you're on a bit of a budget. Then looking at things like what the pots that I found are best to use. Looking at the importance of a transition phase. Looking at which plants I have found have transitioned well from soil to pon, and then also looking at the importance of things like fertilizer and the fact that not all plants will transition beautifully into pon. Let's dive into the first topic, which is the kind of concept of a bit more of a DIY pon, especially if you are looking to do this on a budget. So if you're entirely new to the world of pon, essentially, if I'm not mistaken, it is specifically a product name from a company called Lechuza. So you might see it online as Lechuza Pon. And I'll bring it in a bit closer so you might be able to see. And I've got it in a clear cup, and I'll show you a bit more about the clear cups in a moment. But essentially, it is kind of gravelly stones. There's little stones, and it's lava rock, pumice, zeolite, and if I'm not mistaken, there's also some slow release fertilizers in this. I don't think I've forgotten anything in terms of the composition of it. If I have, I will add it here. But essentially the point that I'm trying to make here is that you don't have to necessarily always go for the branded pon. People just call it pon these days as well because it's become so synonymous. It's very similar if people might call a vacuum a Hoover. A Hoover is a brand, it's not a vacuum. A vacuum describes everything that it is. But it's a media essentially that you can grow your plants in semi-hydroponically. Now, the benefits of that is that you can actually have water reservoirs without potentially, and I'll come back to this in a bit, without potentially giving your plants root rot. So it's for people that want to be able to water, leave the plant there and then come back, rather than the people that want to hover. And to be fair, even the people that hover around their plants and maybe water a bit more, it's a slightly safer way of doing it, but there's a very specific way of being safe with overwatering when it comes to pon. Coming on to the DIY option, essentially you don't have to buy the name brand pon. You can potentially make your own mix. I think I've seen companies on both eBay, Etsy that sell it. There might even be a few shops that would sell it, so you can get. This is probably going to be more suited for the people that are not living in big cities and small apartments, because you're going to need a bit of space for this. You'll understand what I mean in just a moment, because you will get big bags of each one of the component ingredients separately. So you can get the zeolite separately, you can get the lava rock separately, you can get the pumice separately. Obviously with slow release fertilizer, you can get that from most stores basically. And what you would do is you would then create your own mix. Now, if you're going to be doing this, I haven't done this yet purely because I just haven't done it yet, really. I do have the space. I could potentially buy it separately. I probably should. But the one thing I would imagine that you'd probably need is a good container to be able to mix everything in that's relatively sturdy, because a lot of these rocks are quite kind of heavy. And you would need something like a trowel, something that's metallic, preferably not something plastic, because I would imagine if you're stirring up rocks all the time, that plastic will wear quite quickly. So you'd need something like a metal trowel or anything kind of metallic that you can turn the substrate around so it's a good mix of it. Now, there's a lot of people, and I've done previous videos on the kind of pros and cons of pon, and I will link that up the top there. But essentially what a lot of people have said is you don't necessarily need all of the component ingredients. Each one will do different things. So zeolite, I think, will help with the pH, if I'm not mistaken. The pumice and the lava rock capture a bit of that water within the kind of rock structure. So you could omit things like the zeolite. You could even omit the lava rock. You could just grow in pumice. There are a lot of people out there that have been growing in pumice on its own, basically, and there's been some great results. I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's an amazing, and I can't remember what the YouTube channel is, but there's an amazing Swedish YouTube channel that has done a video specifically on growing plants in pumice and the benefits of that, basically. I'll see if I can link that down in the description below as well. But so you could get all the different components, you could make a mix in whatever you want to mix it. The thing with Pon, and I'm sure there are blogs out there that talk about the percentages of each one of the ingredients if you wanted to make it on your own, but I don't think I've ever seen the actual recipe for the Lechuza Pon to recreate it in the same kind of quantities. So 50% of zeolite, 20% of pumice, all these things. I don't think that exists, and it wouldn't make any sense for the company itself to release that data because people could just create their own and not buy their products. So kind of makes sense. But you could go down the DIY route. From what I've heard from a lot of people, it does end up being a lot cheaper in the long run, especially if you're going to need a lot of Pon, because it can be quite pricey. I tend to buy, I think, the 12 kilo bags of Pon, 12 or 18. I can't remember which one the biggest bag is that you can get, purely because it ends up becoming that bit cheaper. But if you really want to go down the more affordable route, obviously mixing your own would be a good way of doing it. And I think you've also got the benefit then of getting different size kind of the gravelly rocks, essentially. So you could get pumice stones that are much bigger than you would get in the traditional Lechuza Pon. And you could experiment with that and see, for some of the plants that have got much chunkier roots, it gives it even more aeration. You're kind of falling a bit into that category of leca at that point, because they're much bigger particles rather than the smaller particles that you would get with traditional Pon. And you can see as well, if I bring it back up again, you can see quite how small those particles are. They're not particularly big. Watch my pros and cons video as I drop Pon all over the floor. That's definitely one of the cons, because you're constantly going to be like clearing up gravel from the floor, essentially. Moving on to the fact that not all plants will acclimate well into Pon. Even not all aroids, in my experience at least. So I'm trying to think now if I can bring up a couple of them and I can show you basically. Right, so the first one I want to show is the Alocasia Black Velvet, and I'll bring it in a bit closer. You can see, I'm trying to see, no, that's just some damage. Ooh, and these are the joys of growing in a conservatory, unlike a regular household environment when you're dealing with most of the pests. I don't know if you can see this on the leaf, and I'll see if I can get it to shine. The slime on this leaf is because there's slugs in the conservatory in the summer. Always great fun. That's a pest that you didn't think you're going to have to deal with in the house rather than outside the house. I am dealing with it, don't worry. But essentially, this was one that I'm going to use as an example. Alocasia as a whole, I have found, because you would imagine with Alocasia, the fact that a lot of the times in nature they will grow near kind of rivers and all of these things. So they do want an airy mix, they do want an airy kind of situation around their roots, but they also do like quite a bit of moisture. So I thought Alocasias, obviously, are a no-brainer. It would definitely work in Pon. And I know some people have got really good success with Alocasia in leca. If you've been here long enough, you know that I've tried leca in the past and I gave up really quickly because I saw my plants deteriorate so fast. I've not had that problem with Pon, but you know. But with Alocasia, it really wasn't the case. So what I found with Alocasia a lot of the times is it would pretty much, if you're taking a plant that's an Alocasia that's in a soil mix, any form of soil mix, even if it's with cocoa coir and all of these things, and taking most of that soil off almost entirely and then putting it into Pon, I found 8 times out of 10, it would lose all of its leaves, it would go back down to a corm, and I would be growing it again from scratch if I was lucky and it didn't rot it all the way through. Now, the interesting thing with this is, and I would say there are ways around that, and I will show you one of those examples essentially. So one of those examples is right here basically. So this is my Alocasia brancifolia, if I'm not mistaken. If I am, I will correct myself and put the name here. But what I did with this specific alocasia is this one was one that struggled a bit in soil and it kind of rotted back down. What I did, I then propagated the corms directly in water. So Emma from Good Growing, and I'll see if I can link her down in the description below. She uses a method called the shallow puddle method, and I'm sure other people probably use this as well, but it's essentially just a bit of water in the bottom of the saucer and you kind of half submerge the corms. I also use it, I also put that in my propagator and you'll eventually get them to root out. Then moving it into something like pond straight away, then there's no problem. You can see it's starting to grow back. Granted, these are small, but these were small corms as well. I didn't knock the plant back entirely. I was just starting with a relatively small plant. But this kind of goes on to prove the point that I wanted to say, that not all plants will transition beautifully into pond. I've got another example here that isn't an aroid, at least as far as I'm aware it's not an aroid. You know when you start questioning yourself going, are prayer plants aroids? I don't think they are, but I'll correct myself if it is. No. But this is the Calathea marcoyano. And this one I had in soil for a very, very long period of time. And then what I did with this one is I knocked off the soil and then put it into pond again because I thought, you know what, it's going to have a water reservoir, it's airy, it's going to have that kind of stable level of moisture in its media. It will do great. I don't know if you can see the bottom bits here, but this took, I'd say probably almost a year and a half to acclimate, and it pretty much stayed the way that it was. It kept like having issues and doing all of these things essentially, but it really didn't like moving from soil to pond. And generally speaking, most Calathea don't like their roots and their soil or their growing media being disturbed too much. So this was a bit of a big shock for a very, very small plant. I don't know if a bigger plant would have thrown more of a hissy fit, but this one really, really did not transition very well at all. But I will show you a different example now of Calathea that was propagated in water and then moved into pond. So not necessarily a Calathea, but it is a prayer plant. It is Maranta, and you might be able to see this is the variegated Maranta. I'll see if I can find the name, and again I'll put it up the top there. But this, and you might be able to see all the little roots that are kind of coming out because this is in a water reservoir at the bottom. I probably do need to repot this very soon. This was started off as a single leaf cutting in water that was being propagated, and you can see this is probably, I'd say 7 or 8 months old. And I mean, it did take its time and it's kind of getting there, and it will work quite well in that way. So let me put this down and I'll continue. Always fun when I'm not prepared for these videos and I get things out of water reservoirs and they're dripping all over me whilst I'm trying to talk to you. But anyway, back to this. With a lot of plants that I found have struggled to transition from soil into pond, a lot of the time, the point I'm trying to make is if you can propagate a cutting from them in water and it's got those kind of water roots and then you put it into pond, 9 times out of 10 it will do really well, basically. Even for a plant that generally won't like that transition from soil into pond, that's the way that you can get around it. It does take longer, and it also means that a lot of the times the slightly larger plants that you might have that are already in soil might not always do the best. I have found something else that I've tried, and I've only ever done this with epipremnums. And I'm pointing at an epipremnum that I've got there. That one I can't get up. I've only just kind of put it down and put it in ponds, so I don't want to disturb it too much. But what I found is if you manage to get most of the soil out and you've got soil roots and then put that plant with the soil roots into water, yes, you will get some die off. Yes, you need to change the water quite a bit because there is a chance that you're going to get quite a big chance that you might get some root rot, but eventually those roots will start kind of developing water roots and you've got a bit more of an established system and you don't end up having to start from a cutting. That also does work. It does take a while. It does take a few months to kind of get there, but it will also work for that kind of transitional period, basically. So that is another way of doing it. If you see that certain plants won't do that well transitioning from soil to pond, do kind of try putting them in water propagation and then move it into pond that way. And generally speaking, you should have better success. There are obviously going to be some plants that probably won't do well in pon at all. And I have not tried this, so I do apologize. If you know that this does work, do drop a comment down below. This is just based on my experience. I have never attempted to move something like a fern into pon. And the reason for that is that the roots are so fine. I know it generally likes that kind of even moisture. It probably would like pon if you can kind of get it in there and kind of be able to get the roots to grow in pon. I've never tried it. It wouldn't be one that I would attempt to try. But if you have, I'd be really curious to see if you've had good experiences transitioning ferns into pon. Obviously with things like begonias most of the time, and I found really good success with my cane begonias specifically. If you've got any form of cane begonia, which is the one that grows upright rather than the rhizomatous ones that tend to be a bit more of a scrambling begonia, those ones, if you water propagate the cane begonias, and you'll still get those fine roots, those you can then move into pon, basically. And the one thing I will say is if you're moving from a water propagation into pon, you can pretty much go straight into a water reservoir, no problem. However, for most other plants, you're going to need a transitional period. That brings me quite nicely into the topic of a transitional period for your plants. And this is something that I got from a friend when I was first starting off in terms of information. I know this has been around for a while. Lechuza Pon, or Lechuza itself, does mention this, I think, on their website somewhere, and even when you buy the pond, that it does recommend that you have a bit of a transitional phase if you're moving from soil into the pond. And that is for a lot of aroids specifically. You would want to obviously knock all the soil off the roots, move the roots and everything into the pond, so plant it into the pond. But then what you would do is you would have a pot that has got drainage holes, and I'll come onto pots straight after this topic. You'll put it into a pot that does have drainage holes, and you will water it as normal. And that worked. And I was a bit nervous because I thought this was drying out way too quickly, much more quickly than soil was. But actually, I kind of really trust that friend that was kind of mentioning this to me. So I kind of went with it. And I was surprised, basically. So basically what you would do is obviously move it into the pond and then water it in a pot that does have drainage holes. Water it, let the water run through. Obviously have something underneath to catch the water, or do this over a sink. But what that does is a few things, basically. So with pond, generally, when you're putting it into whatever pot, it's good to have rinsed it to get a lot of that dust out. Even if you're doing the DIY version, there is a lot of dust that happens. And those first few months of the transitional period, it's not a few weeks. Ideally, if you can do it for a few months, is quite good because that will flush out any dust particles that you might have originally missed during the initial rinse through. To be fair, I've had plants in pond for a while now, and they will always have some form of dust potentially coming out of it one way or another, basically. But that is highly important to transition your plants. And what you would then do is, say for instance, I was transferring a small cutting of my esmeraldens. What I would then do is I would make sure that if not a cutting, say I had a small version of the esmeraldens, I'm trying to think of what else. Okay, right, here we go. So I've got this plant and this is in soil. So this is the Epipremnum amplicium, and I'll bring it in so you can see. It's very cool plant with very long strip-like leaves. Sometimes you can also get one that has got silver on the leaves. I've got the all green version, but say for instance with this one, I would move it out of its soil, I would put it into pond, and then I would water as frequently as I was watering in the soil within the pond. Got that? Because you would think that you'll see your pond, especially if you're just starting off, you'll see that your pond, on the surface at least, on the very top of the pond, you'll see it drying out and you'll be like, oh, it's dry, it's been 2 days. I can't, like, I'm supposed to be watering every 7 days. Is it going to dry out a bit too much? I'll say this one more time for the people in the back. You will do less damage with underwatering rather than overwatering. So don't stress about that too much. But also you're giving the plant chance for those roots to kind of get themselves familiar with that new substrate without having to then contend with that substrate being evenly moist all the time, which could cause some stress, which then could cause some root rot even within pond. So however much you want to go for the pond, because of the notion of a water reservoir, you still are going to need to transition it, and as I said, a few months. There are the odd occasional plant that I might only do the transitional period for, say, 4 to 6 weeks, but a lot of my plants, I think, have been in a transitional period for about 3 to 4 months. So that gives you an indication. The friend that was talking to me about transitional period, I think she was mentioning that some of her plants, she's been transitioning for a year. So she doesn't get the benefit of a water reservoir for a year before she's then fully confident that, you know what, I'm going to then give them a water reservoir and they'll be fine. I found that sometimes with mine, it doesn't always need that long. Granted, I have had some plants that have been in pon without a water reservoir and just getting flushed and getting watered as normal for nearly a year. So yeah, they can do it, no problem whatsoever. But yeah, definitely a transitional period for pon is kind of important. As I said, it just gives that plant time to acclimate. As per my previous point though, if you've had something that's been in water propagation, at least in my experience, that can move into pon with a water reservoir pretty much straight away and it won't be an issue. I would almost recommend it. I haven't tried it. It always makes me a bit nervous to move a water propagation plant with water roots into pon and then do the transitional period, because then I think those water roots will dry out a bit too much. So, but yeah, as I said, I've had good results doing both of those things. So if it's coming from water propagation, putting straight into a water reservoir, that's fine. And if it's coming in from soil, you definitely need a few months of transitional period just to make sure that everything works as it should. Now on to the topic of pots. And I know it's probably not the most exciting one, but for people that have already started to go into pon, or they're looking to go into pon and they're wondering what types of pots to go with, I've got good news for you actually. You don't need to buy specific Lechuza pots or even water reservoir pots or self-watering pots that are made for self-watering. You can do it yourself. It's not going to look the best, but you can do it yourself. And there is a way that you could kind of make it look quite fancy with things like hash pose. There is a downside to that I'll talk about in a moment. But let's start off with the really, really basic of just using a regular nursery pot. So yeah, just using something like a regular nursery pot, nothing fancy. It's got the drainage holes at the bottom. Obviously, it needs to have drainage holes. But obviously, the first question that you might have is, if these drainage holes are quite large, these little pebbles are going to go straight through the drainage holes. So I do have a solution for you there that I have worked, and it has worked really well for me. And it also helps with a bit of recycling. So I don't know whether or not you would get this in, I would imagine you can get this in most countries, and I'm trying to just kind of clean this out a bit. But this is an old kind of plastic net baggie for onions. So for instance, what you would do with this is you would snip off the end parts basically, and I'm trying to do this on camera for you so you might be able to see. You take that off because obviously that's what's connecting the whole thing together. You would then split it down the middle, and if you've done what I usually do with these things when I'm just a bit like caveman style when you first get it and you need to get the onions out, you put your fingers in and you pull it apart. Yeah. But then essentially what this does is this gives you a square net, which makes the holes a bit smaller. And what you would then do, obviously you would cut it to a smaller size. You would pop it into the bottom of the pot, and you might be able to see if it's at the bottom of the pot, then the pebbles won't fall through those large drainage holes. And this is quite good. The one thing I will say, and I have tried different ones, the finer the mesh, it could cause a bit of problems. That's why I like these, because these holes are a bit bigger and they'll keep the stones in, but it won't create too much water surface tension, I think is what it's called. For instance, a smaller mesh net, what you'll get a lot of the times is it will keep the water in as you're watering it from above and you're trying to flush it through. And then you really do need to sit there for a while whilst it drips through, because the holes are so tiny that the water sometimes struggles to get through. It might get clogged by all the dust. This one I tend to find works the best. You still need to let it drain out a bit slower and kind of tip your pot like that after you've watered, so the water will drain from the side there. But this works like a charm. And essentially what you would do is, after you filled this in with pon, you would then put it into whatever drip tray that you might want to have, as you would normally have for most of your plants. So you'd water it, you'd let it drain out, you put it back on, done basically. That's during the transitional phase. However, if you want to stay within the same setup, and that's why I always use a slightly larger kind of drip tray, even for a smaller pot, when it comes to the self-watering stage, after you transition this is your self-watering. Most of the times they say you want to have the water level to about a third up the pot. Granted, this might be a bit lower, but essentially if you fill that drip tray then with water, and this is sitting in it, it's got the drainage holes, so it is wicking up through the pebbles, essentially through those drainage holes. That's your self-watering. It's nothing fancy, but that is your self-watering essentially. What you could do if you wanted to make this a bit more visually appealing and not have that appearing everywhere in your house, you could just go for something like an opaque or something decorative in terms of a cache pot, and the same way that you would put a pot with soil in, do the same thing. Just make sure that the cache pot is just that tiny bit bigger, so you've got a bit of water that you can put down at the bottom, and it could work as a water reservoir for your self-watering. Now, the problem with this that I would say is you won't be able to see the water level. So you will need to check quite often to see when you need to refill the water as well. Another top tip there that again a lot of people will skim over when they're looking at instructions for pon is ideally you want to be letting the water reservoir dry out for a good few days before you water again, rather than, oh, that's immediately dry, let's put more water in. Because again, that helps minimize the risk of things like root rot. And there's a reason for that as well. And I'll touch on that really quickly now is, and again, I'll bring up the clear pot with the pon in it. If this would just been watered, and I can't really show you on anything that I've got at the moment because it's not quite at that stage, is you might get some dryness that's happening at the top. Again, a bit of a disadvantage of using traditional kind of nursery pots is because you can't see through it. But with this, for instance, and if it's something like a clear pot, you might see that it's dry at the top, but then what you might see is condensation that's happening there. And that is because the pon lower down isn't dry yet. The top layer might be because it's exposed to air and everything around it, but this bit isn't. So that's still got quite a bit of moisture in there. And that point of kind of letting it stay dry for a few days, even when the water reservoirs run empty essentially, is because you're giving those inner bits of pon some time to dry out before you put more water in it, thus avoiding a bit of root rot, because again, root rot tends to be bacterial and it tends to be anaerobic, and too much water will basically mean that these bacteria will grow faster, causing more root rot. And what you're doing by letting it dry out is you're exposing it to air, and it kind of kills off some of this bacteria as well, because then they've got abundance of like oxygen and air around them basically. But yeah, let's talk about the clear pots. And when everybody keeps seeing, and I know I'm not the only one, loads of people that will use things like clear plastic cups. And let me show you. So what I would generally do, and this is for propagations, these are for some of the smaller plants, and I have got 3 different sizes. Whilst I drop one size, give me a sec. Got 3 different sizes of clear plastic cups that I have found. This is a hell of a lot cheaper than buying most other pots and everything, and it will get reused. I know some people will be like, obviously this is single-use plastic. Ironically enough, this is probably getting used more than what its intended use was going to be anyway. So yeah, but any one of these, basically, depending on how big you are, and this is the good thing as well, I found sometimes with those tiny plastic clear cups, not very often that you can get small nursery pots, but sometimes when you're starting small propagations or small cuttings, these things are really quite useful, and then you can transition them to bigger and bigger. And again, if you're moving from soil, again, you can move into these containers. But what you can do, and let me show you, you can do this with all of these basically. This is what I like to do, because obviously you still need to create drainage at the bottom of those cups, is go for something like a knife. Be very careful with this and obviously pay attention. But what you can do is go around the edge and just do little kind of slivers cut right at the very edge of the bottom. And let me show you basically. Just be very careful not to cut these too big. But again, if you've got a whole 100 plastic cups of, if you mess the first one up, you'll learn quite quickly and you can correct it for the second one. But what you can then see, hopefully that's coming up. Yeah, you can see that there. You can see the cuts that have happened all the way around. And essentially you've created a drainage layer there. So when you were going to put something in like pond, if you were going to put the pond in there, and imagine it was full and then obviously the plant was in as well, whilst you flush it, the water will come out the sides. And again, this works the same way that if you had with the nursery pot, you would pop this into something like a drip tray and it'd be fine. Sometimes as well, people have seen some of my other videos, I use old Lurpak containers or anything that's plastic. You can reuse a lot of the kind of plastic containers that you get different types of food in. I'm thinking sometimes old ice cream cartons and all these things, as long as they're plastic, that's fine. And I know that's not for everybody. So some people might want a more aesthetic solution. And I'll show you one that I got given as one of the gifts on the goodie bag from the most recent plant swap that I went to in London, which was amazing. Let me show you. So this is a type of ready-made self-watering container, essentially. So you can see there's pond at the top. There's a bit of an area where you can put the water in. Sometimes you also get, if this is opaque, if you can't see the water reservoir, and this is essentially where the water would be, you might be able to see a tiny bit of water there. There you go. So yeah, sorry, this is my Monstera Adansonii Aurea variegata. I don't know if it's coming up particularly clear. You might be able to see it there, which does kind of like go down to like a creamier color. And you can see some of the other leaves on the side there as well. But what you can do, the benefit that you get with these is several things, basically. So one, the water reservoir comes out. There's different types of these. I'm showing you this one because this one is from Paliplants, which is an amazing company. Check out their Instagram as well. But I think they were one of the sponsors, if I'm not mistaken, of the plant swap. And there are ways you can just kind of clip it back in. So the good thing with this is, A, you can see the water level. So you can see when you need to water. You've also got, because it comes off at the bottom, you can then flush this as well, because that's another thing that not a lot of people talk about when it comes to pond, is that ideally what you would like is I'd say every month, every 2 months, you should just be watering with clear water and flushing the system through just to get any kind of buildup that's happening in that kind of reservoir and the container just out, basically. So you can do that obviously with the clear cups that I was talking about because it's got drainage holes, and you can do that with these types of just a regular kind of nursery pot. What is tricky, however, and this is the biggest tip that I would say, is if you're buying something like from Lechuza or for anything else, and I'm trying to think if I've got anything, I've got one that I'll show you now. So this is a different type of pot from I don't think this is Lechuza. I think this is just one of the cheap ones that you can get on Amazon. So this is my variegated Billietier, or this was a couple of cuttings from it there. But you can see there is a water level indicator, and that is because it's an opaque pot. It doesn't have an inner pot that I can remove and flush. So this is a bit of a negative for these types of pots that are cheaper. So most people will go for these, and that's what I did in the beginning. And I fully knew that there was going to be some issues with this, but I was just starting out. I wanted to get some ready-made because I just didn't want to faff with everything else at the beginning. And yeah, they were good. Would I ever buy them again? Would I just spend those extra bit of money to buy the ones with a removable inner, or to go for pots like this where you can see the reservoir and remove the reservoir and be able to flush? Yes, 100%. I would always go with that because this is a pain now. In order to, when I need to do flushes, I'd need to put my hand. You end up losing quite a bit of pond, potentially down the sink, and then flushing it and doing that a few times. This is a bit of a pain. I would not go with these. Any of the other options are actually better than this, basically. This is quite aesthetically pleasing, potentially, but there's a bit of an issue with this one generally. But yeah, let's move on to the next topic. So the last little bit that I wanted to touch on is things like fertilizers. Make sure that you've got a semi-hydro fertilizer. Not all fertilizer that you would normally get for your plants would be good in semi-hydro, which is a situation with pond a lot of the times. And you might run into some problems as well. I'm not going to do a full video about this because when I was doing the mixing myself with the different components of the macronutrients and the micronutrients and the blooms and the grows and all of these things, you can get different types of semi-hydro or hydroponic fertilizers. There are whole channels and videos dedicated on just this topic. Go and do your research there as well. It is a big one. If you like to geek out about these things, go for it. I thought I did because I had a bit of a science background, so I did a lot of chemistry growing up. It got a bit much even for me. I'm just like, oh, God, nobody got the time to do all this. So what I ended up using, and I've shown this over and over again, it's liquid gold leaf. I know you can definitely get it in the UK. It will ship to Europe and the States as long as you do big enough orders, potentially. I'm not sponsored, obviously, but this is the one that I've been a diehard fan of for 2 or 3 years now, I would say. And this one does work for semi-hydro. It takes a lot of the guesswork out there. If you don't have the benefit of being able to get something like this, don't despair. There might be other companies that do have kind of pre-mixed everything in semi-hydro fertilizers that you can get rather than getting each one of the individual components. If you want to get the individual component parts and start creating your own mix and testing and seeing what works and what doesn't work, by all means, you do you, basically, but it was just a bit too much for me. But yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to touch on. Just to kind of summarize, you don't have to spend a lot of money. You can do DIY versions of your own, mix your own kind of Lechuza Pon. Same thing, you don't have to buy really expensive pots. You could just go for things like nursery pots or disposable clear plastic cups and reuse them. You can also reuse a lot of things. If you've seen that section of the video, I'm reusing quite a lot of things that would probably get thrown away and recycled and all these things, but I'm recycling in the house and they're getting a very long use, much longer, especially things like the nets for the onions and the garlics. Basically, these things, not a lot of people would keep these, but these get a lot of use in my house. Make sure that you're fertilizing correctly, make sure you're flushing, make sure that you've got a transitional period. And above all, enjoy, really, and you'll do things your own way and you'll find things that work for you. These are the things that worked for me, but because quite a few viewers actually ask what I do and what I've kind of learned along the way, I thought I'd do this video and let you all know. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. If you've got any questions, comments, as always, drop them down below. I'd love to have that conversation with you. And it's nice to see the community kind of like interacting with each other now as well. I cannot tell you how happy that makes me. But yeah, as always, have a great rest of the day and I shall see you soon. Thanks. Bye.